Welcome to a new webinar from World Languages. We're really happy that you're here with us. That being said, it is my pleasure to introduce you and welcome you to this new webinar, Empowering Heritage Language Learners in the Spanish Classroom. And we couldn't be happier to have two amazing World Languages sales representatives, Alba Vega Beloy and Brit Marie Solis. Thank you very much for being here, girls. I'm gonna give you the floor.
Thank you so much. We would like to share today's agenda, today's plan, so you can take a look at what we're going to be doing today. First off, Alba and I will introduce ourselves so you know a little bit about our background and a little bit of what brought us to talk about this topic today. We will then talk about the survey that was sent. We are going to then share some of our personal experiences with heritage language learners, a call to action, and some strategies that you can hopefully implement in your classroom, and then we will be concluding.
First of all, I would like to apologize for my voice. I'm a little bit sick, so this is not my regular voice, but hopefully you will understand what I'm saying. So as you can see here, I was born and raised in Spain. I was there until I was 24, I believe. And then I moved to the US, which was in 2018. First, I moved to New York and I spent there a little bit over 4 years before I moved to California. I needed the sun, I needed the warmth. I was done with all of the winters, not gonna lie. My BA is in English Philology by Universidad de Oviedo. Then I did my master's degree in English as a second language education from Universidad Isabel I. And then for my experience, I taught English and Spanish for a little bit over 9 years, and specifically here in the US, I've taught Spanish 1, Native Language and Arts 1, and Native Language and Arts 2. But of course, I transitioned now out of the classroom in 2023.
Now I'm going to share a little bit about myself. My name is Brit Marie Solis. I am a native Spanish speaker. I am originally from Panama. And while I was growing up, I moved around a lot with my family and actually spent time in multiple Spanish-speaking countries. We ended up in the United States in 2001, first in California. Then we came over to Colorado, and I studied Spanish literature at CU Boulder. I have my master's in foreign language education from the University of Northern Colorado. I was a high school Spanish teacher for 15 years. My 3 main levels that I taught for the majority of that time were levels 2, 4, and AP Spanish language and culture. And I transitioned out of the classroom in 2023.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the survey. I believe it was sent out to you, but some of you didn't respond, and that's okay. So if you could please write in the chat the answer to any or as many questions as you could possibly do in like a few minutes. The first one is, do you have any experience teaching heritage language learners? Are you currently working with heritage language learners? Do you have a separate class for heritage and then second language learners, or it's a mix? Do you have them both at the same time? And then number 4, what are your challenges? What are your issues, your big things, big ticket items that you have in your classroom that you would like to put a solution to? Okay, I can see some answers. It's a mix. Yes, yes, yes. I'm in Maine. Few heritage learners, that's fair. Grades 4 to 8, separate class. 8. Have to pay varied levels. Low-level material and resources, that's always an issue. We are fluent in spoken language, but know nothing about grammar. That sounds so familiar to me. No separate class. Okay, elementary schedule. Mix, knowing how best to differentiate for them. Okay, we're definitely going to talk about differentiation, parent exacting materials. We have plenty of examples for you about that. So that's great. English as a second language teacher. I recently got my master's in Spanish. I've been teaching Spanish in MO, have mixing all the classes. Perfect. Okay. Not separate class. Their experience is so different than mine. Yes, that happens a lot, but that's okay.
This is awesome. Thank you, everybody, for being here. What incredible experiences everybody has.
Thank you so much for your answers. Actually, this is very helpful. At the advanced level, it's not so much of a problem, but in the intermediate level, they understand maybe speak the language, but the reading skills are very limited. No writing skills. Yeah, that happens. Okay. Not Spanish though. That should be okay. This could work for any other languages that you may have in your classroom. The strategies should extrapolate fairly well to any other language. All right, perfect. I think we can move on. Thank you all for letting us know. República de Panamá. Nice. Free Spanish. Yeah. Awesome. So hopefully with all of the things that we're gonna say today, we're gonna help you out a little bit. And of course, if you want to know more, if you ever need anything else, you can always reach out. We also have PDs, and I'm sure we have more webinars coming up that will also help you in your journey to become perhaps a better teacher. All right, so now I'm gonna start with my personal experience with heritage language learners. So my experience, I think it's quite different from Brit Marie's. I started teaching here in the US in 2018. I was in the South Bronx. It was my first experience teaching in the US, my first experience teaching in a high school setting, my first experience teaching a full class in Spanish. It was a lot of firsts for me, I'm not gonna lie. And also, it was my first experience teaching everything from scratch. We didn't have any materials. I had to create every single lesson, every single plan, every single scope, all of it by myself. So it was basically chaos. I'm not gonna lie, it was chaos. I was dropped into a classroom. First day, my head of the department quit a week after I arrived. I again had no materials to work with. I had no support. I basically had to figure out what to do, and I had to do it fast because again, everything was chaos. So next. So one of the main issues that I had is that when I went into the classroom, my students did not trust me. And I mean, why would they? They didn't know me. They weren't familiar with me, so why would they trust me, right? So one of the many reasons why they didn't trust me is because my accent was different. Because I am from Spain, I sound very different from them. My students were from Mexico, Dominican Republic, they were from Puerto Rico. So my way of speaking was very unfamiliar to them. Then it was my first time in the US. I had no idea what the Bronx was about. I was super unfamiliar with everything around them. I didn't know their context. And also, which didn't help at all, of course, they have had at least 4 teachers before me that I started in October. And it was a jungle. Those classes were like, they had no structure whatsoever. They were just used to do whatever they wanted to do because they didn't have anybody to like say anything to them. And on top of that, I had the typical sentence of like, Miss, but why am I here? Why am I in this classroom? I already know Spanish. I'm Hispanic. I speak Spanish to my dad. I speak Spanish to my abuelita. I don't need this class. I don't want to be here. So my question and my first goal that I had to have when I entered that classroom was, how could I make them understand that I was on their side? So how do I do that? The most important thing for me in a heritage language learners classroom is to create an environment of trust. Incredibly important. Whatever your context is, you have a story, just as your students. Of course, it's going to be a different story, but you still have one, right? For example, for me, I told them about why I was in the US, how did I get here, why did I decided to study English in school and then become a Spanish teacher. And all of that story, that background that made myself me, helped them open a little bit of a door in order for them to communicate with me, for them to explain to me what was their context about. So again, in the chat, if you could let me know, what do you tell your students about yourself, and if you ever tell your students something about yourself? I tell my heritage speakers that you cannot be fully bilingual until you can pass a version of the English language states this in Spanish. Oh, interesting. They reflect and realize their Spanish was not at that level. Yep, definitely. Okay. Anybody else that want to share? By the way, there is no right or wrong answers in here. Completely okay. I tell them I make mistakes all the time as a Spanish speaker and get made fun of by my family too. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I studied English as my BA and still cannot really speak properly, and that's okay. I tell my students about my mental health and that I'm a dog that feels what they feel. That's awesome. I'm a great supporter of social emotional learning in the classroom. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I talk about my personal experiences being a Spanish speaker, growing up in the US, staying with friends and family, share the challenges I had with grammar. This is perfect. Great. So this is one of the ways that you can start connecting with your students. Absolutely. This is all fantastic. This is perfect. About my learning Portuguese experiences with my in-laws. Oh, that's so sweet. That's so sweet. Yeah, every single story that you can tell them that basically makes you feel more human to them is already gonna create bridges, and it's already gonna help you create this kind of trust inside of the classroom. My second point is listen carefully and listen a lot. Social and emotional learning, as I said before, is incredibly important to me. And many of the time, we have a plan. We know what to do. We thought about this course for like the whole summer. We planned so many exercises, and then we go into the classroom, we meet the students, and we realize that what you planned is like so far off from actually what they need, but we still don't change anything. Why is that? Why is that? No, we need to make sure that, of course, we listen to what they need and perhaps change our plans accordingly. Because, I mean, we didn't know the students 3 months ago, so perhaps what we thought they need is different from what we know now. So, hey, there's nothing wrong about changing course in the middle of something if you know you're going to improve it, if you know you're going to make it better for your students. And my last point is make sure that you include everyone in your lessons. And I mean everyone. Many of the materials that I used to take a look at before would only focus in the proper Spanish, or like perhaps the Spanish from Spain, because it was like the official one and it was like super cool and whatever. And that's not what it is. We know that the Hispanic culture is so vast and so big, and we have so many things to talk about. Just make sure that you include everybody in your lessons, all right? And I think, yeah, I'm not gonna keep talking because I think everybody needs to speak. I'm taking a long time. So next. Oh, no, sorry. I have a second goal. Never mind. My second goal is to turn your class into a language and arts one. And this is very important. So the way that the heritage language learners adopt their language is very different from the second language acquisition, right? In English, when you go to school, you need to choose your path. You need to choose if you want to be an ELA teacher or an SEL teacher, correct? They have these two separate paths because these two types of students are completely different and have different needs. So the same happens with Spanish, right? I have a couple of pictures in here. Hopefully we can do this very fast. So click on next. There you go. Everybody, put in the chat. What type of student do you think this is? Is this a heritage language learner? Or is this a second language learner? What do you think? They have a very strong comprehension of reading and listening. They're okay with writing, and they cannot do the speaking. There you go. Second language, right? Very good. You're doing great. Yeah, exactly. This is a picture of how the second language learners thinks or has the connection with the language, correct? However, if you think about heritage language speakers, you have to swap things around, correct? The speaking would be in the first part where like it's so defined and so well drawn. Then in the middle, perhaps we have comprehension. At least that's what I had in my classroom. And then the one that is barely there, maybe a 3-year-old drew that, that would be writing for my heritage speakers. Again, that's the concept that I have from my classrooms. They didn't know really how to write. They were speaking so fast and they knew how to speak. However, the writing, I mean, I don't want to say atrocious, but kind of. It wasn't great. All right, you can click on next. And then because of the differences that we have in between heritage language learners and second language, heritage language and second language acquisition, then for the heritage language learners, we have this difference in between the two-pack and the usted pack. And this is taken from a talk that Miss Kim Patowski, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, gave actually was led a couple of weeks ago. It was fantastic, and I had to say it. We have the heritage learners coming into the classroom with their two-pack version. They have the informal Spanish. They got that. It's magnificent. They got it. They know how to communicate. It's great. However, we need them to move a little bit towards the usted pack, right? They need to be a little bit more academic. They need to be a little bit more refined. That doesn't mean that you're taking something away. Please do not take away what they already have, what they already know and use. Don't take it away. Make sure that you're always adding something else. If what they're missing is the academic vocabulary, add that in. But don't make sure that they don't forget about what they already have from home. Click on next. So for that, just make sure that quiz or ask your students what they know before starting a new topic or a new unit. It's very different to know about meta language. For example, what is pretérito perfecto simple? What is pretérito anterior? Do you really want them to know about that specific name for that specific tense? Or do you want them to know how to write an essay with arguments for the AP test? Do you really want them to know, oh, what is subjuntivo? When should I use subjuntivo? Or do you want them to express themselves correctly when they're doing a job interview? You need to decide inside of your classroom what your goal is and what they really actually need for their day-to-day lives. So for me, communication is much more important than that meta language. Sometimes, not everybody, focus on a little bit too much. And the last thing that I'm going to say is be careful about stigmatized language. Please do not say in front of a student that they're saying something wrong. It is true that some of the words that they might say are not recognized or may not be in the dictionary, but if a whole community says it, it's not wrong, all right? It's just stigmatized. It is true that it might not be what's on the books, but that doesn't mean that they're saying it wrong. It could be really offensive for a student if you're saying that something that they're saying with their abuelita, with their family at home, and you're just telling them, hey, actually, that's wrong. You're basically insulting their whole family. So please make sure that you're very aware of that. Just, again, don't take anything away. Just add something new to their knowledge book. Thank you. Next.
All right, I'll tell you guys a little bit about my experience because my experience is a little bit twofold. I arrived in the United States as a 16-year-old. I was a native speaker of Spanish. I had attended elementary, middle, and a little bit of high school in my first language, which was Spanish. I arrived in California. I was placed in an ELL course for about a semester. And so I actually did not have any experience in an L2 class until my senior year when I arrived in Colorado. I was essentially recruited by the AP Spanish language teacher, And when I arrived in that class after much convincing, because my parents did not understand why this Spanish teacher wanted me to sit in their classroom, I ended up being the only native heritage speaker in the classroom. And my experience was a little bit bizarre, so I figured I would show kind of what happened. I think my AP teacher always had really good intentions, but once I got recruited to be in the classroom and I was sitting there, I don't think she knew exactly what to do with me. So, what my experience became was I became the teacher. I was tasked to learn the advanced grammatical terms that were at the AP level that, you know, that needed to be taught. And being an extremely high achieving student, I would go home and study for hours. It was the very first time in my life that I had to go home and sit down and study Spanish grammar because I had been busy learning English. So I think she always had good intentions, but I don't think she realized the amount of anxiety that it cost for me to have to go home and plan lessons for peers that I had no idea how to teach or whether or not those lessons were going to be effective. And, even though I eventually became a Spanish teacher, it was my very first time facing these concepts that I had never seen before. And I was put on the spot and made to be a teacher. Next, if you fast forward to my professional career, I eventually became a high school Spanish teacher, as I mentioned in my introduction. And my experience as a high school Spanish teacher was that I had a very few number of heritage language learners just because of where I was geographically in my school district, though that number did grow in the past 3 to 5 years because of monetary issues. There was never the ability of creating a class that was specifically for heritage language learners. So, what ended up happening, like I know happens in many school districts, is that the students were essentially placed in L2 courses. And a lot of those students ended up being placed in my AP Spanish language and culture class. And so, of course, as the AP Spanish language and culture teacher, I am having whiplash. I'm having deja vu of, oh my gosh, what am I going to do to make sure that my students are going to have a better and a more fulfilling experience than the experience that I had being a native Spanish speaker, a heritage Spanish speaker in an advanced course. Next. So, what I ended up coming up with were two main goals. And these goals drove me for a really long time because I wanted to make sure that that experience was enriching. My very first goal in my class was rapport and creating a mutual understanding within my classroom and getting to know my heritage language learners. I wanted to make sure that I got to know them before they even stepped foot in my classroom. So I dedicated some time to finding out the rosters for my classes and identifying those students who had been placed because they were heritage language learners into that advanced course. And I created pre-class questionnaires that I sent out to those students, that I pushed out to those students before the course started to begin those conversations, start getting to know them, and also pre planning things that I could bring into the classroom from the very first day of class. So, my first question of the night for all of you is, what is your favorite way of getting to know your students? And at what point do you do that? Do you do it before the school year or the class begins if you're in a semester long class? And how do you do it? If you don't mind writing that in the chat. What is your favorite way of getting to know your students? Beginning of your questionnaire, yes. Ooh, guess who? I love that. Awesome. Excellent. Love that. I think we all have those ways of making sure that we start creating. Oh, I love flip videos. I love that. And create rapport, not just between you and the students, but also creating community within the students themselves. I think that's really, really important because then they start finding commonalities, which I love. I love that. Oh, special person interviews. I'd love to learn more about that. Love it. Excellent. Keep sharing those ideas, even if I'm gonna keep going on just to make sure that we're moving on. Because if you have something good that somebody else has never done, maybe we can start a good conversation there. The second thing that I love doing with my students was including their point of view in the course. I always wanted to make sure that they were able to bring in a little bit of their toolbox into the class and share that in. I also made sure that we discussed their goals for the course because a student that is placed in an AP Spanish language and culture class, because there's literally nowhere else where the school can find a place for them, I want them to feel like there is an end game for them. And I want to know, what do you want to do with your heritage language? I had a lot of students who wanted to go in fields, obviously, that they were going to need to be they needed to be bilingual. Some of my students became nurses. Others of my students were going into business schools. Others were going into trade schools, which is all wonderful. But I also had students who were sitting in an AP Spanish class that were not there for the 4 or the 5, who were there simply because they wanted to improve their Spanish. So then when they went to the rancho and visit their family in the summertime, they could talk to all their family members. So making sure that you know what those goals are when they're sitting in your L2 class, so important. And finally, something that really, really just made my heritage language learners flourish in my classroom was that in my particular school, we had the ability and the luxury to take our kids to do stuff outside of the classroom. We call those activities communities, and they were events all over the community that then we would chaperone, of course. Many students chose to bring their parents, their siblings, and it kind of became a celebration of culture, of their heritage culture, and they could see it taking place around the community. My students and I did all kinds of things from going to an opera in Spanish all the way to celebrating El Dia de los Muertos at the Botanic Gardens. We went out to eat. We took them to plays. We found as many opportunities around the community so that they could see themselves in the world at large. That was just really wonderful. And it really created a bond with all of the members of that class. Next. Also important and very similar to what Alda mentioned is my second goal became creating a sense of pride in their Spanish knowledge. As Kim Potowski mentions, there are instances in which heritage language learners are made to feel like they are imperfect speakers. And we need to make sure that we are honoring all of our students' backgrounds, their community, and their upbringing. We want to make sure that we are trying to give positive feedback and instilling respect towards all variety of the language. In my school also, I had the ability of giving enrichment, which I know is growing in different districts. So we did enrichment 2 times a week. And I utilized enrichment time to have one-on-one opportunities to sit with my heritage language learners and have discussions where we could go through their essays, discuss things that they noticed that they were doing really well, talk about things that they wanted to improve, and really have those opportunities where we were just level talking one-on-one and just really talking about the language and how it's growing in a way that was constructive and instead of being a criticism. And the last thing is making sure that you are talking about relevant and updated topics that are pertinent to the students that you have each year. I used a lot of those pre-course questionnaires to create units and activities within my AP Spanish language course, which I realize is a tall ask. But I noticed that when I tailored my school year around the students that I had that particular year, there was a lot more buy-in from the students and a lot more willingness to participate. So for me, having a classroom that was ever evolving really, really helped because I was directly addressing lessons to match that community of learners that I had for that particular point in time. Next.
So now we're going to talk about some of the materials that we offer and how we can extrapolate some of the things that we have said into actual real world examples for your classes. So I'm going to start with my call to action and my strategies. Next. So one of the things that I would like you to focus on, especially if you only have heritage language learners in your classroom, would be culture and texts. Different type of texts, different type of cultures, so they can improve their community skills, right? You need to make sure that you bring current, relevant, and culturally appropriate texts that engage your students. And of course, for this, you need to use real life scenarios, something that is going to grab their attention and that is going to be really applicable to their everyday lives, right? And make sure that it's not something old-fashioned, perhaps something they can use for their real lives, for an AP test, as I said before, for a job interview, or even perhaps if they want to move to a different country. What if they need to, I don't know how to apply for a university in a different country? What if they need to go to an interview that requires the Spanish language? These things are real scenarios from day-to-day life that they might have to face in the future. So that those two examples would be great for them. Of course, great discussion in the classroom that foster inclusion and a global mindset. Don't focus on, again, as I said before, the proper culture or only one specific aspect of the culture. But as many materials that we've seen in the past, they are specifically focused on food and perhaps traveling. I've seen that a lot, and that's great. I mean, it's part of the culture and it is fantastic, but there's so much more to culture than that. What about writing? What about art? What about theater? What about music, traditions? There's so much more that you need to make sure that you expand every day these topics that you can talk about inside the classroom, right? And my last strategy or my last call to action would be to make sure that the students are applying critical thinking skills and expanding their vocabulary. Of course, if you have a heritage language learner class, they already know something. They come to your class with a base. They already know how to communicate. Make sure that you add to that, that you expand, that you're helping them grow what they already have, because they already know a lot. And in most of the times, most of the cases that I've faced, it doesn't seem like it at the beginning, but they actually really want to learn and they really want to know more about these different cultures and these different things because they're part of their context. So now, how can MAPAS, this first series that I'm going to bring you, how can MAPAS help you achieve these goals? This first example that I have here is from the MAPAS 2 in Unit 4. And as you can see, it's a little bit on the economy side, but it's talking about basically fashion. This unit is about fashion, and I came to realize that this is a very hot topic for students. It doesn't matter if they're boys, girls, they are all into fashion, especially in high school. And this is a topic that you can take a lot out of. For example, here you're going to talk about la fibra de alpaca, del oro de los Andes. And again, it's a little bit into fashion and also economy. So perhaps you could create a debate inside of the classroom about fast fashion. Doing debates was something that really worked well for me because it allowed them to express themselves and their opinions in a controlled way while making sure that they were using the specific usted back, so to speak, that formal vocabulary that I wanted them to practice. So doing debates is a great way of making them practice that communication skill. And again, this topic is very relevant for them. Fast fashion is something that they hear about every day. Also thrifting, perhaps that you could also talk about that. And something that is very important with this series, with this MAPA series that we have in here, is if you click on next, you're gonna see that on the side you have different headphones, right? And this is because this text is a texto locutado, which means you have 1, 2, 3, 4 different accents for 4 different audios. So you're going to be able to listen to this text in Mexican Spanish, Spanish from Colombia, Spanish from Spain, and I believe the last one is Spanish from Cuba. You have representation from many different countries for the same text. So you could spend one whole class just listening to the different accents of the people from these different countries and just focusing on their pronunciation, just analyzing what are the differences, what are the similarities, what do they do the same, how do they do it differently. So even though you're talking about fashion and this is the topic of the unit, you can expand so much more. You can talk about many different things that are related to the topic, but technically completely in a completely different way, right? And then if you click on next, you're also going to find that all of the texts for this series have textos mapeados. Every single text that is in this book series, in this mapa series, they're going to have these type of text that have different colors, right? Click on next, please. All of these colors mean something different. So for example, the blues, you see it says marcadores en conectores. For the orangey ones, combinaciones frecuentes, so words that normally go together. And then the green ones, verbos, sustantivos, y adjetivos con preposiciones. So this is a very visual way for students to learn perhaps combination of words that work together, or then verbs or connectors, things that are going to be useful for them in a writing. For example, in an AP exam. This is something that they could analyze and then extrapolate into their own writing for their own skill set. Click on next, please. And then something that is also very important is that for every single topic that you have, you're going to have a mapa de combinaciones. And again, this is kind of like a vocabulary map, but in a cool way. It's not just the word and the meaning of the word, because I mean, again, this is heritage language learners. They need something more. They already have the basics. So we created this in order for them to expand what they already know. For example, una camiseta, un suéter, una prenda de ropa, right? That's very basic. But here you have una camiseta manchada, una camiseta arrugada, una camiseta estampada. Again, this has infinite possibilities for you to play within the classroom. You can show them this and then tell them, hey, actually, just add every single thing that you know. Perhaps they don't like estampada, but they want to say a cuadros, con flores. They would be able to add to this whatever they want. Things that they would use in their own context, which is great or I think it's great in that realm. And this again brings me to the usted pack versus tu pack. We are adding to what they know. We're not taking anything away. This they know, perfect. Add to it, right? Next one. And then here we have an infographic. Before, we had a tag that it could be an article, reading on a website, or in a magazine. But here we have a different type of text. We have an infographic. And in this case, we're talking about discrimination against women. Again, very hot topic that your students, believe me, will have something to say about. I had a debate about this in the classroom and things got heated. It was magnificent. I really, really liked it because they had so many opinions and all of them wanted to say so many things. It was fantastic. Again, for these topics, I encourage you to create debates because they really live it. Like they live through that debate and they want to win it as if it was the last thing that they were doing in their lives. It's amazing to see. And if you click on next, again, we have a different type of text. In this case, we have a real life interview and we have representation. We have a Black woman here who is an author and in Spanish, which is fantastic. She's talking about women. She's talking about discrimination. She's talking about her way of writing female characters, which is again a very non-basic way of going through the topics that are going to be important for them. And in this case as well, if you click on next, you're also going to see that you have a mapa de combinaciones for this particular topic. You're going to talk about rights. You're going to talk about suffering. You're going to talk about being in charge of something, right? These are not basic vocabulary words or combination of words that are going to encounter on their day-to-day lives. This is something a little bit more elevated that are going to help them grow and expand the vocabulary that perhaps they already have, that it is more basic, right? So this is a fantastic example of one of our series that are going to help your heritage learners in the classroom in the sense that they're going to grow what they already have without taking anything away. You can click on next. And I believe, yes, my last example is about the teacher's edition because it is extremely helpful, extremely helpful. As you can see in the middle, what you're going to see is the student page that they see, but also on the sides, what you have is comments, and these comments are going to help you guide you through the lesson. They're going to help you basically interpret the lesson, and they're going to help you give you some tips perhaps on what they can ask or what can you do with the students in the classroom. Click on next, please. I think you can see it a little bit better in here. It's going to tell you, okay, so you're going to work on the interpretive and interpersonal communication in here, right? You're going to talk about this map and you're going to see the combinaciones frecuentes with the texto mapeado that I showed you before, right? And also you're going to have it as a texto locutado. You're going to be listening to this and you can listen in these different accents that I told you about before. Next. And then again, in here, in the planning section, it's going to give you ideas on what to ask your students further and even beyond what the actual lesson is about. For example, here, it's going to tell you, okay, your students need to do this, blah, blah, blah. They need to do that, read the text, listen, then answer. But at the end, it says, can we collaborate and write a definition of emotional intelligence? That is something beyond what it says in the textbook. That is something that perhaps you could do with your students that it could be interesting for them, right? You can make them work in groups. It's going to give you suggestions on how to use this lesson to make it better or to adapt it to your students, which is, in my opinion, fantastic. And I believe that is it for me. Next.
And now, similar to what Alba has been sharing, I would like to talk a little bit about heritage language learners in the L2 classroom. Next. My call to action for those of you who are in an L2 classroom and you have heritage learners, go back, is to give back. Give heritage language learners the space and the empowerment to enrich your Spanish class, because they're already bringing in a lot of cultural knowledge that is pertinent to their heritage. They're already going to have a toolkit, a vocabulary they can also share with the rest of their peers in the course. And finally, making sure that you allow those students to bring in their perspectives and their way of seeing and experiencing the world because of that bilingual background. So my examples today are actually going to come from the Reporteros program. I'm going to address the annotated teachers edition, which in my opinion is absolute gold. And then I have examples from Reporteros 1 and Reporteros 3. Next, the very first example that I have is from the Annotated Teachers Edition, and this is a page out of the very beginning of the ATE where we dedicate this whole space to heritage learners in your L2 classroom and how you can make sure that you are supporting them while also making them empowered in that particular class. This was actually put together by Kim Potowski, who wrote one of our chapters from Honing Our Craft, which Alba will be discussing. And I love that piece because it's already telling you, hey, take a look at the wealth of knowledge and amazing experience that these students are bringing with. Let's just make that just even better. So with Reporteros, we actually have a fantastic tool. If we go next, we have created an entire parallel program that will go along with the Reporteros series to engage those heritage learners that are in L2 courses. So in this example, we have Reporteros 1, and your students in the L2 class are learning about the house. So you see there's a lot of scaffolding for those students because if Reporteros 1, those kiddos are going to be in novice low level and kind of progressing through that proficiency. So you have a lot of pictures and vocabulary boxes. We have a program to work with your heritage learners. So if you do one click, please, you're actually going to see that there is a next click, a worksheet that matches these pages that is going to match this particular activity, but elevate it just a little bit so that your students can you click next so we can look at the differentiation worksheet? So that they're actually still going to be talking about houses. In this particular case, this reading is going to be all about haciendas, and your heritage language learners are going to be reading a short text about the origin of haciendas and specific haciendas that they should visit if they ever go to Mexico. And then in the next page, if you hit click, we're going to see the activity that goes along with it. It's actually matching different people, a traveler, a blogger, a blah, 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 family, to the best hacienda that they can visit and explaining why. So they're still going to be talking about houses. They're still going to be using the vocabulary, but we're also elevating that by including a little bit of history, a little bit of geography, a little bit of vocabulary, while also making them feel included and not left out because they already happen to have a background in Spanish. In Reporteros 3, which is our next example, we have a completely different concept. So this is going to be a little bit more advanced because now we're not in level 1, we're in level 3. The students are going to be learning about living well, los conceptos de vivir bien según las personas en los Andes. And so in level 3, your students are going to be matching statements. Well, we want to include our heritage language learners. So you're going to notice if we click that your heritage language learners are going to get to have, click again, a worksheet that matches this text with a little bit more depth, a little bit more oomph, and a little bit more difficulty, a little bit more critical thinking, so that they're doing a text that is similar. They're going to be working with similar vocabulary, a little bit more advanced. And then if we click again, you're going to see that the activity for your heritage language speakers is actually going to include a little bit more writing and critical thinking, because then it takes the reading and flips it so that they can talk about how does this relate to you? How does this connect to your life and your experience? And boom, there you have it. All of a sudden, you have your heritage learners with full buy-in, talking about and bringing in their point of view, their background, their vocabulary, their toolkit into an L2 course. I absolutely love the heritage language worksheets because I wish I had had a tool like that when I was in the classroom. I had to build everything from scratch, and here Reporteros is already creating that for you. All right, I'm going to hit next here because I want to talk about differentiation very quickly. I know we're running over and I want to respect everybody's time. Another thing that we need to make sure that we're keeping in mind are differentiation practices in an L2 class. And we need to keep that in a growth mindset. Differentiation practices, I know, is kind of one of those things that we have to get comfortable with. There's a wonderful CLTA session on differentiation, but my colleague Christy already did a whole webinar about differentiation that you're welcome to watch. We want to make sure that those differentiation activities are going to give depth to all students and also respect to all of the students, and that they're going to allow for voice and choice. And there is mention of a tic-tac-toe strategy, which I really love, because Deb Blass would give her students a tic-tac-toe with a menu of options. And we're so used to having tic-tac-toe that goes across or up and down. And she said, how about we don't do it that way? What if we just make sure that things are touching? Or maybe they can do four corners, or you turn it into something a little bit differently, just to make sure that they know there's different ways of showing understanding. Two things that I really that I did that really worked well in my classroom were stations. My students did not have to complete every single station. They could pick and choose the stations that worked for them. And in that sense, it gave them ownership, it gave them choice, and the same with project menus. Those were two differentiation pieces that worked really well for me in the classroom. And just two extra little ideas that you can look into to see if that's something that might apply for you and your students. And three things to always remember: your heritage language learners are not just receivers of information at all times. You have to also remind them that being proficient in more than one language is an absolute special talent, a superpower, if you will. And last but not least, making sure that you always remember that your heritage language learners are not supposed to be there to tutor, and they're not the teachers. They're still there trying to get something out of your course. Keep going, Alba.
All right. And I'm just going to say this very fast, you guys, because I know we really are running out of time, like Marie said, so I'm so sorry in advance. But I just wanted to let you know that if you even want to know more than today, we have this beautiful book that is called Honing Our Craft. Some of the topics that we mentioned today and many others are included in the different chapters of this amazing guide to the world language classroom. You can click on. The book is going to help you with the everyday issues of your classroom, focusing on one topic at a time. If you click on next, you're going to see the indice of the book. And all of the information that you see in this book is going to support the pedagogical framework that all of our materials have. And of course, we'll offer practical strategies and practical things that you're going to be able to translate into your classroom. And of course, I have to mention the author, one of the authors for chapter 8 is Ms. Kim Petowski. I know we have shouted her out a couple of times throughout these webinars to make sure that, hey, if you like her, we really do love her here. Perhaps you will be interested in this book. And actually, something that I have recently learned is that we're going to open a book club for this book. I believe it is in April. Somebody can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. But we're going to start a book club so different educators can discuss the different topics of this book. And again, that's going to start in April onwards. So make sure that you email us if you want to join or if you're interested. Oh, awesome, Paula. Thank you very much. You can email us and we'll let you know when it starts for sure. You can click on next.
And now I promise we're going to let you guys go very soon, but we want to just conclude with a few ideas. First off, we are not perfect. The goal is not perfection, but rather continuing to have a growth mindset about heritage learners in our classrooms. We won't always do it perfectly, but my gosh, we got to just keep trying different things. We need to make sure that we're keeping an open mind, that we stay creative, that we find tools that make these risks a little bit easier. because growing and trying things out is uncomfortable. So let's find some tools that are going to help us do that in a more, practical way. And don't forget to talk to your heritage language learners, because at the end of the day, they always want to be heard, and including social emotional learning practices in your classroom so that they know that you care about them as individuals. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And we're sorry for running long.